Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Allawi. The U.S.-Iraq Security Pact stipulates that all American combat troops will withdraw from Iraqi cities at the end of June. Some Iraqis suspect the Americans will not keep their promise. Others view that same American promise as a betrayal and abandonment. Meanwhile, Iraq is struggling to exploit its oil potential, revive its economy, and move the country forward. This week's guest is uniquely qualified to comment on these issues and the challenges Iraq faces. He was a former defense minister in Iraq's interim governing council after the fall of Saddam Hussein. He was also a minister of trade and finance. And I am now delighted to welcome Dr. Ali Allawi, a senior visiting fellow at Princeton University and the author of Occupation of Iraq. Dr. Ali Allawi, welcome to Inside Iraq.
Thank you, Jassim.
Let's move to SOFA, the status of forces agreement recently signed between the US and Iraq, which stipulates that by the end of this month, combat troops will be withdrawn from Iraqi cities. And yet there were exceptions made to that stipulation, and that is from certain parts of Baghdad, certain parts of Mosul, and even in Diyala, American combat troops will remain in these cities. What is your assessment from a defense point of view?
Well, I think obviously the Americans are not too sure about the ability of the Iraqi security forces to face and sustain a confrontation, a challenge from a reorganized or regrouped insurgency. I don't think so. I think it's slightly at fault, simply because the nature of the violence in Iraq has changed and the nature of the insurgency has changed. It's no longer led by Al-Qaeda. It no longer has the same kind of uniform support it did in large parts of the country. The thing is far more fragmented. Violence is much more selective, much more targeted, and has not yet and is unlikely to reach the levels that we had between 2005 and 2007.
If that is the case, how much credence do you put in what al-Maliki confidently says that once the Americans are withdrawn at the end of 2011, Iraqi forces will be able to handle the country?
Well, I think the Iraqi government continues to be the single largest holder of military power in Iraq, and there isn't any single other group that's able to challenge it. At the same time, the Iraqi Central Forces don't necessarily have uniform loyalty to the state in the sense of a clear chain of command and that they're completely loyal to the commander-in-chief. There are groups and there are divisions of loyalties and responsibilities. I think that by and large, the Iraqi security forces can face off any single challenge from either insurgents or from regional groups or from political parties who may not see eye to eye with the government.
Let's just point at two challenges potentially in the near future. One is the Al-Sahwa, the Awakening Councils, and the other Jaish al-Mahdi. Both these groups are abiding their time, watching the political and military scene carefully, and perhaps at a later stage they will choose their own battle.
Well, the Sahwa has been eroded a great deal in terms of its cohesiveness. It's not only one organization, it's not one single uniform group. It's now broken up into fragments. Some of them have joined the political process, some of them are trying to run for political office, others have turned to criminality, but most want to see a way out of this. I don't think they'll revert to their arms as quickly as people think. Some may, but nevertheless they don't have either the cohesion or the support of the United States. That's lacking. So the Sahwas have become fragmented and fractured.
Is this what al-Maliki counting on? That's the fracture and the lack of money with the Awakening Councils? That is perhaps giving him the confidence that if they challenge the authority of the central government, he will take them on?
I think so. At the same time, you mustn't forget that the Iraqi security forces are now over 600,000 people. We have an army that's about the same size as the main army of Iraq under Saddam. So there has been a massive expansion in the security forces. Even though not all of them are loyal to the central government, if enough
of a
proportion are loyal, I mean, there are groups that are still loyal to those who put them into the chain of command. There are officers who are not necessarily professional officers who are brought in by the various political parties. There are people at a lower rank who may not have gone through the training program of the Iraqi army. Some of them have been weeded out, there's no doubt about it. But if push comes to shove, a significant portion of the army will continue to be loyal to the central government, but some might not.
So the genesis of a default or perhaps a fault line within the Iraqi army, if a civil war in the future erupts, then we might see a similar case to what happened in Lebanon?
Yes, and what happened in Lebanon is that a portion of the army mutinied and the rest of the army stayed neutral. I don't think this will happen in Iraq. If there is an escalation of violence, I think most of the armed forces will continue to take command from the commander-in-chief, who is Prime Minister Maliki at the moment.
Let me stay with the Iraqi army. I read a few assessment of the Iraqi army by American think tanks where the figure 75% of the former Iraqi officer corps is exactly back in the saddle. Is that your understanding?
Yes, it is, but I mean, don't forget that Iraq had a huge number of officers. There's about 25,000 retired officers of the rank of colonel and above, simply in the Mosul area. So we're talking about a very, very large number of people who were in one way or another associated with the armed forces. So drawing from that pool is something that's natural. But I don't think that they were brought in sort of as entire units at a time.
There is a move by a certain group within Iraqi parliament in order to weed out some of the top brass currently in the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Interior, simply because they were part of the old regime, and yet they swore loyalty to the current regime and to al-Maliki, and they helped him tremendously in his combat in Mosul and Diyala and Basra. Do you see these calls rising in the future once Sahwa is weeded out, once perhaps even a Sadr movement is snuffed?
No, I don't think so. I think over time there will be greater cohesiveness of the armed forces and greater willingness on the part of even those officers who may be skeptical about the changes after 2003 to take orders and to be commanded by the central government or by whoever is responsible for the central government.
One of these difficult conditions, Ali Allawi, I can anticipate perhaps is the rising tension between Baghdad and Erbil can only manifest itself in military confrontation. Perhaps we saw a glimpse of that in the past, and perhaps in the future, if Baghdad and Erbil don't see eye to eye about certain rights or what they call the disputed areas vis-a-vis Diyala and Kirkuk, that might come to a loggerhead.
Well, I mean, theoretically, yes, but I don't think it can happen because unless there's a dramatic change in the distribution of political power inside Baghdad, as long as we have the current landscape of Iraqi politics, I think there will be an attempt to threaten and saber rattle and so on, but I doubt very much if it will come to blows.
Since you were a defense minister during your tenure, how much influence, whether military, financial, or otherwise, did you witness Iran was playing in Iraq? And how would you assess Iran's current role? Right now, Ali Larijani saying that our role is the soft power. Has Iran changed its views and practices in Iraq?
I think the overarching aims or goals of Iranian policy in Iraq have not really changed since 2003. I mean, they got a massive boon, a massive free gift, as it were, from George Bush by overthrowing their most implacable enemy after the Taliban. So, and nobody would have expected that anybody could do that internally. So the entire geopolitical situation changed to their advantage, and they want to make sure that under no circumstances can Iraq go back to the conditions or circumstances where it can threaten directly Iran's national security. So this, to me, is one of their main aims inside Iraq. Another aim is to stop Iraq being used as a platform by the United States and by other powers to attack or to undermine the Iranian regime. A third objective that they may have is in fact to ensure that the current distribution of political power, which favors the Shia community, is not overturned or is not undermined by a different political setup. This, to them, ensures an Iraq that is non-threatening in terms of their national security. Obviously, they have a great deal of soft power. They have a lot of people who have one way or another relationships with Iran.
Perhaps one potential change, Dr. Ali Allawi, is the federal election early January. Perhaps it might change slightly the political spectrum, but not much.
Well, there are two main issues, I think, in the upcoming federal elections. One of them is whether the sectarian basis of politics will continue, in the sense that the major blocks, parliamentary blocks, which are built either on sectarian affiliations or on ethnic affiliations, will one way or another take over the political scene or continue to dominate the political scene. If that happens, then I think the nature of Iraqi politics will be to a large extent defined by the deals struck between Shias, Sunnis and Kurds, and Iraq will be seen in terms of this triangular relationship. If that pattern doesn't hold, if we're not able to create a unifying governing plan based on alliances between sectarian and ethnic blocs, then the next likely thing to happen is fragmentation. There's no single national leader who's able to dominate the political scene. Most of the parties will, on all sides, with the exception possibly of the Kurds, will fragment. I don't think anybody will achieve more than 10 or 15% of the national vote. And the other aspect of it is that what I call the neo-Ba'ath, that is elements of the former regime, not necessarily those who believe in the ideology of the Ba'ath, but any group that in one way or another feels itself having lost as a result of the 2003 changes, will regroup and form a kind of alliance between secularist group, nationalist group,
Al-Ba'ath has been forbidden from practicing politics, and we will know whether in the future Iraqi politics will allow them to come under a different name or even under their old name. Looking at you, I cannot help but seeing you wearing three hats. You are a defense minister, a finance minister, and a trade minister. Let's take what you are really good at, and that is you are a scholar in finance and you lecture all over the world. How would you assess Iraq's state of economy right now?
The economy really has not changed significantly in terms of its over-dependence on oil, and this continues to be the main driver of the Iraqi economy. All the attempts to diversify the sources of revenue of the state, as well as to diversify the economy, have not really been successful in the past, not only a few years after the fall of Saddam, but in the last 30 years. Iraq is very much an oil-dependent economy, and what happens to the economy is a function of the oil price, the volume of oil produced and exported, as well as the efficiency of the way in which these resources are utilized. And unfortunately, this is a situation that I expect to see for the next 5 to 10 years. Iraq is very much a mono-commodity economy. It's based on oil, in spite of the fact that it has huge agricultural resources, it has huge industrial, transport, logistics potential.
One hears the accusation flying left and right between the finance minister and the oil minister, between Bayan Salah Jabr and between Hussein al-Shahrastani. Bayan Salah Jabr says, you know, I don't have enough money in the treasury simply because Hussein al-Shahrastani failed to benefit from the astronomical rise in oil prices last year. It reached 146, and now it's plummeted to about 40 and 50, and that's why Iraqi treasury is depleted, and there is not enough sufficient money to somehow to come up even with some of the basic infrastructure. At the same time, Bayan Salah Jabr is being hammered that the money is not properly used.
Well, it's true, but the point is that the expenditures of the central government in terms of salaries, wages, costs of the security establishment, pensions and so on went up dramatically over the last 3 years. So the fixed costs, as it were, of the Iraqi government are extremely high. And it was based on a certain oil price level and a certain volume of production in order to meet the revenue demands of the state. Now what happened is that there was an explosion in expenditures, primarily in the form of transfers and increases in wages and salaries, and the oil sector itself has not caught up in terms of the volumes produced. In fact, there's been a slight decline in the production of the southern oil fields. So all in all, you can say that it was both a problem of an exploding budget and as well as a decline in oil revenues, and we had, as it were, a perfect storm.
What about the personnel? I mean, I don't mind sharing with you some of the sentiments expressed by many Iraqis and experts that people at the helm at the ministries, they are not qualified. I fail to come up with a good example except perhaps the finance ministry, Bayan Salah Jabr, who was just recently the interior minister, and before that he spent many years outside Iraq, and perhaps with his admission that he does not know much about finance.
Well, I can't really comment on specific cases, but what I can say is that he's in that position because he's a senior politician in a major party that's part of the coalition, and it's to be expected that those who are in senior political positions are given senior ministerial appointments. I mean, this happens in every democratic country around the world. But what I can say is that the entire machinery of state is in a very large way decrepit, it's dysfunctional, it's unable to meet the demands of reconstruction or to manage the needs of a modern state and a modern economy. So in spite of the fact whoever is in charge of these ministries, a lot of these issues and problems will continue simply because the machinery of government is so degraded.
So basically you are seeing the deeper root of the paralysis currently entangling Iraq, and that is it goes beyond the personnel and goes beyond what the existing structure.
Yes, I mean it's both. I mean obviously if you have poor economic, financial leadership, poor policy making, poor implementation of policy, irrespective of the quality of the machinery of government, you're going to have a problem in the final result. And at the same time, if that's compounded by poor management, a great deal of corruption, a lot of poorly qualified people in important positions of power and authority, the problem is compounded.
It is compounded indeed, and it's a double poison when you have not only corruption but you have bad management. Let us just take the last case of the trade minister. Since you were a trade minister, and as we say in Arabic, الشيء بالشيء يذكر, we have to mention what happened to the last trade minister, Abdel Falah al-Sudani. He was charged with corruption. Right now he's being questioned by Iraqi judges. You know, billions of dollars they have been spent and looted from Iraqi treasury on some shady deals as well as some rotten food.
Well, I mean, we have to assume that one is innocent before one is found guilty. So the presumption of innocence will always apply. And I think in this case, we have to be clear and honest and charitable in saying that the case against the former Minister of Trade has not yet been proven. However, this doesn't mean that there is no large-scale corruption in the Ministry of Trade as well as in other ministries. The fault, I'm afraid, lies in the huge universal subsidies of the Iraqi government that were introduced in the 1990s as part of the sanctions program, and then were continued by the Coalition Provisional Authority and subsequent Iraqi governments. Every single Iraqi is entitled to a substantial calorific intake over a 30-day period. So the government is the sole importer.
Without which I might add, Dr. Ali Allawi, millions will go starving.
That's true, but at the same time, to concentrate so much power and resources in one ministry and to give people discretionary control over purchases of huge amounts of foodstuff, wheat, oil, cooking oil, rice, sugar, tea, all these huge decisions are made by a few people that are connected with an international network in which corruption is automatically a consequence. Nobody has tried seriously to reform the system. I tried in the early days when I was a Minister of Trade to in fact put the entire purchasing program of the Iraqi government out to internationally qualified advisors under the authority of the United Nations World Food Program. But subsequently it was negated, and we went back to a few people making huge deals. I think because of the amount of surplus or economic rent, as economists call it, in the purchase of these goods. Because you have so much discretionary power in the hands of few people in the Ministry of Trade and in other ministries, there's a great deal of surplus profit.
I understand the rationale, Dr. Ali
off.
Allawi, and I understand exactly what is going on and even the background and the genesis for this program instituted by Saddam Hussein. But yet, I don't understand why there is no mechanism in order to combat it. Look at the Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki. He has admitted that he has no power whatsoever to remove any minister, even knowing that they are corrupt and they are stealing the country blind. And yet, the sectarian quota system prevents him from removing any minister, which begs the question by many Iraqis. So what is the alternative?
Unfortunately, this is a power-sharing formula in which major posts in government are allocated according to which party or group or sect you represent. But it is not one group that is charged with this. I think the entire system is prone to abuse, misuse and corruption. So if one party is responsible for Ministry X is involved in large-scale corruption, you can't really go after them because they can point an accusatory finger at other ministries. So the whole system is basically paralyzed, and criminals get away with their actions at the highest levels of government, and this is what has happened.
No wonder the Inspector General of Iraq Reconstruction, Stuart Bowen, called it the second insurgency. As a matter of fact, one feeds on the other.
It's true. I mean, even in the early days, I said that corruption is a national security issue for Iraq. Not only does it eat away in terms of the integrity of the government, but it creates powerful concentrations of resources and wealth outside of the government and can be used or abused to undermine security and stability and to buy politicians and buy favors. And what we've had now in the last 5 or 6 years is a massive transfer of resources from the state, state coffers, from the treasury, to groups, some of them mafias, some of them connected to political parties, a huge diffusion of power, authority and resources from the state to private parties. Basically the privatization of the state to criminal gangs and mafias attached to political groups.
It is unfortunate indeed, but it's only a question of time before either the entire system collapses or somebody needs to go in with a surgeon knife and remove all the cancerous cells out of it. But let me ask you, perhaps in the last minute or two available to me, knowing what you know now and what you have gone through regarding the Iraqi enterprise, would you have gone and joined this group in zeal to help your mother country?
It was a very difficult question. In some ways, it's an unfair question because when I joined the government in September of 2003, it wasn't really, I would not have known how things would have unfolded. There was an occupation, there were attempts to create a new national identity for Iraq, and looking at the mayhem and the chaos that happened afterwards, then it's a very, very difficult question. I say that we were before in a cage, and now we're in a dark tunnel. The question is whether you prefer to be in a cage or in a tunnel with some end in sight. I think overall, the changes after 2003 certainly could have been managed better, certainly could have not ended up in the kind of violence and chaos that we've had. In the pre-2003 period, the way in which the regime managed its affairs and managed the affairs of the country made that option extremely remote.
Look at your crystal ball. You said we came out of that cage and we are into a dark tunnel. What part of the tunnel are we in now? When do you reckon that Iraq will come into the bright sunlight?
I think when we reach a new political balance, a new equilibrium, not only dominated by the post-2003 groups, there has to be a recognition that a significant part of the Iraqi population did not expect or accept the changes of 2003, that they have legitimate fears and that these fears have to be one way or another contained within a new political order. So if we reach this kind of balance, I think we can have a reasonably stable and reasonably prosperous and successful society. In my mind, it will take another perhaps 5 to 10 years before that we can see these green shoots sprouting.
A senior visiting fellow at Princeton University, the author of Occupation of Iraq, Dr. Ali Allawi, thank you for being a guest on Inside Iraq.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you very much.
To access the show and to send us your comments, please go to aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Until then, have a great week.